The reason I recommend this for people who like Dark Souls and Soulsborne is that it's difficult. It really does scratch that itch that that's ferrying us Soulsborne fans along there. We like that difficulty. Now, half of that difficulty comes from the technical shortcomings, which is a challenge unto itself. But I wouldn't say that's anything to scoff at. I'd say that's a challenge to be taken on. For this next segment, for all the Dark Soul players out there, what if I told you there was a game out there that predates Dark Souls, predates Demon's Souls, in terms of the third person, difficult kind of genre, the Souls-like as we now call them. Now, a lot of Dark Souls and Demon Souls and Soul-likes all borrow the creative DNA from the older RPGs, the first-person dungeon crawlers, which FromSoft made quite a few back in the days of the PS1, for example. But there is one game I would like to recommend for the Sega Saturn, and it's a game that is frequently overlooked and ridiculed. And that is Virtual Hydlide. Hope you can see that there. Just realised I've not got my software up. Now, this article comes from Bad Game Hall of Fame, written by Cassidy, titled Virtual Hydlide. Now, as I've always been saying, we use articles at this early stage of this channel. This article is massive, absolutely massive. It goes through the entire development history of not just Virtual Hydlide, but the earlier games on which this was based on. So, please check the link in the description for the full article. But here's an excerpt about the actual Hydlide game. History has a funny way of reflecting on innovators. If you look back on popular canon, it's never the folk who tried and failed who get their due. It's the dudes who step in afterward who can capitalise on the groundwork laid. You don't hear much about it until Antonio Meucci's Talk and Telegraph, but Alexander Graham Bell's telephone has gone on to be credited as a game changer for communication. Galileo effectively stole his idea for a telescope from Johann Lipinski Krichner, whose misfortune was not being able to secure a patent for his original optical instrument. But for the grace of God, goes Hydlide, which couldn't precisely nail its attempt at a still theatrical action RPG on the first go, but has suffered obscurity in the shadow of Legend of Zelda in 35 years since. In case you didn't pick up on it, Virtual Hydlide is a retelling of the events of the original game. In fact, according to a statement made in the English manual, Virtual Hydlide should be served as no less than a, quote, perfect 3D reproduction of the original. Take a minute to measure the weight of that statement, and not to build whatever terrifying expectation you may think in your head. Now let go of that expectation completely, and take relief in hearing that T&E, the developer, Odd Boast, could not be any further from the mark. While Virtual Hydlide might mirror the basic narrative and some of the progression beats of the predecessor, it otherwise chooses to distance itself from such a rigid structure. As a matter of fact, the first you'll do after launching the game is to shake the very foundation of Fairyland, which is the fictional world it's set in, to generate a new world by either choosing to input a seed code which the game will use as a reference when filling up the map, or allow the game to decide at random. This idea would be proposed by Tokiro Naito, who originally took inspiration from roguelike titles he had been enjoying, such as 1993's Toniko no Daboken Fushiga no Dungeon. While Virtual Hydlide itself is not a roguelike, this will not be the last of the inspirations it draws from them. To re-elaborate on the randomised elements, the world seed I mentioned, the game first rearranges the locations of all the pre-established points of interest on the overworld, as well as shaping the surrounding terrain. The dungeons you'll be visiting are also susceptible to randomised layouts, where the floor plans, branching paths, set dressing, and all of the treasures contained within are all subject to drastic differences between generated worlds. What will remain within the same across the playthroughs are the number of floors comprising each tile set, the bosses in their arenas, and the guarantee that you will find items essential to progressing through the game somewhere within their designated dungeons. In effect, Virtual Hydlide is still very much a linear adventure, requiring completion of the same objectives in the same order every time. So really what this means is the consequential differences between the playthroughs effectively boil down to having to learn new map layouts, and whether or not you'll get lucky in regards to non-key inventory items that might appear, and when. If this bare minimum was all Virtual Hydlide had to handle, it might do the job well enough. Unfortunately, Virtual Hydlide is an action RPG, which means there's only about 100 more objects to account for on screen at any time. Rather than further taxing the 3D rendering and potentially slowing the game to a possibly unplayable extent, the majority of scenery and objects and characters are all rendered as 2D sprites, and made to scale with your distance and to and from them. With this implementation, often falls to account is the direction you are facing, to where most sprites are simply forward at all times. Foliage, decoration, landmarks, and other miscellaneous props all turning in place as you do. The effect may be genuinely distorting to some, especially given the sheer number of objects liable to appear on screen at any given frame. At the very least, enemy sprites generally tend to be rendered from multiple different angles, so that you're able to rotate around them and effectively flank them as needed. Granted, this would all be pretty standard fare for players already familiar with the likes of Doom and what have you. The difference is ID Software were clearly a little bit more conscientious of how their sprite display worked, and rarely dared to populate the viewpoint with hundreds of simultaneous sprites at once. It feels as if T&E simply tried to incorporate as many different decorations as they could within each given tileset, likely in the interest of detailed, realistic environments, but ignored considerations for the density of objects on screen. In effect, the game often struggles to scale and redraw them all on a frame-by-frame basis, or to update the screen at a rate reductive to fluid gameplay. To put it bluntly, the frame rate sucks. Managing somewhere in the neighbourhood of 20 frames per second at the best of times, as low as 5 frames per second at its worst. As the game chugs along, it elects to skip or drop frames rather than slow gameplay down, which at least means the tempo is more or less consistent throughout. But poor performance absolutely distracts from your abilities to move and react to enemies and hazards, or to effectively rotate to face a specified intended direction. What's a shame is that the 3D aspects of the gameplay are generally decently impressive for their time, as is the level of detail that went into the 2D sprites. But it's all obscured by so much in the way of jagged scaling and cluttered spaces, and made to perform at a frame rate so pained that many players will simply be unable to tolerate. There's one last point to make about the graphics. Our beloved hero, Jim, yes, his name is just Jim, is completely stiff. And I'm not just talking about the lack of discernible personality. What I mean is to say, by the very nature of being a digitized actor, he only has so many sprites that can be used to convey his presence, and most of them make him out to be like a particularly inflexible robot. Everything from his stand and stance to the way he runs just comes across as rigid and unnatural, and serves to disconnect you from any sense of really inhabiting him. But where his sprite-based approach really begins to lack is in the equipping different armours and ornaments. Where Jim's actor was not photographed actually wearing these plate mails or wielding individual weapons and shields. Where it comes to what's in his hands, you'll find the same stances and animations used across his entire mix and match arsenal. If you choose not to carry fish shields, for example, Jim's emptied offhand will look as if it's flailing in the air as he walks foes with his right hand. And when it comes to different armour, these layers are simply drawn on top of Jim's base model where they seem to fit rather naturally. For all Tokiro may have fit to change and update as to be contemporary, and as for a novel idea as random generation may sound on paper, what Virtual Hydlide fails to offer is a sense of freedom for players, to tackle the set of necessary objectives in whichever order they personally determine to. And while that's certainly not strictly a necessary component for an RPG, I'd argue that it would be suited for Virtual Hydlide more so than the ultimate decision to railroad players along its singular, inflexible path. With its randomly generated map, move away from level-gated combat encounters, and consistent tossing of various different weapons and armours, the game really does feel as if it was originally built with the intention for adventurers to visit dungeons in whichever orders they pleased. But with the tool items serving as keys to each of these successive stages, that possibility is completely and thoroughly prevented, and it's a damn shame too. because having that degree of freedom would have made a far more interesting and exciting game. More than anything else, this marks Virtual Hydlide's most wasted bit of potential in my mind. And a damned shame again, I say, because for what it's worth, I actually still enjoy Virtual Hydlide. It's completely uneven, granted, but entertaining nevertheless for me. If you can still look past the dire frame rate situation, as many players of the area were uniquely programmed to do, there's an interesting world to be explored within, with uniquely stylized dungeons and a vast array of enemies to populate them, and randomised aspects to be noted and appreciated across replays. I appreciate the difficulty is never too unfair, with most of its skippable combat encounters, abundance of healing options, and handy continue functionality allowing you to pick up at the beginnings of the dungeon where you should die. If you could approach the game as a sort of guided tour for a twisting and transforming fantasy land, I really do think there's a bit to learn from it and to admire throughout it. Sure, it can sometimes feel a bit empty or sparse, not helped by its rather weak sound library of ambient audio samples, but it still feels like a world worth digitally inhabiting for the course of a typically 2 to 3 hour playthrough. And after that, to check out if it was a new randomised seed, and to see what new feng shui old Nosferatu is trying out his digs. On the other hand, just as I surely understand how folk can play Virtual Hydlide and get nothing out of it, for those raised on more modern action RPGs, Virtual Hydlide must read as pure regression and feel clunkier than straitjacket charades. The fact that the game presents its own combat is completely skippable, doing little to even attempt to make it compelling, is probably enough to lose most players straight away. And to that must feel like completely mendering exploration and navigation, when compared to the likes of Dark Souls or Diablo or what have you, and there hardly seems to be any hooks left with the chance to sink them in. And that's pretty fair, honestly. At the same time, Virtual Hydlide also seems to get a bit further away from what even fans of Virtual Hydlide may have wanted out of it, losing out on simpler combat, the hand-constructed world, and even the comforts of the classic grind. Topping it off with so many new layers of equipment and consumables, and the random chance could feel something like a betrayal to those who appreciate the more uncomplicated qualities of the classic game. So if this game isn't for either the modern or classic action RPG audience, who exactly is it for anyway? And I guess the answer comes down to, well, folks like me, I reckon. Players who can appreciate a game for its ambition while excusing actual execution, who can overlook some of the more barely functional and outright busted elements of the game, while applauding the developers who are trying to aim for. For me, that means going along for the ride on the hero's journey, travelling the unmapped terrain, seeking out the necessary treasures, braving the hostile dungeons, and challenging the head villains in charge. With the rewards and level ups granted for overcoming each trial, I could totally buy into a sense of growth and regression. The sense that Jim had begun as a hapless wimp with just a wooden club to his name, and had become the fairy's chosen knight by the end. Call me sappy or call me simple, but I'm a sucker for the feeling of adventure in games, and Virtual Hydlide managed that feat well enough for me. So, as I said, the actual article is massive. That was a small segment as long as I went on there. But basically, good old Hydlide here, as he was describing, is an RPG when you're going through a randomly generated world and you're going from dungeon to dungeon, collecting items which you require to unlock the next dungeon until you get to the end and fight the big old winged guy here. I've forgotten his name, I'm sorry. For anyone who has a Sega Saturn, because from what I understand, emulation is pretty hard for the Saturn. So if you're fortunate to have a Sega Saturn and you like Dark Souls or Soulsborns, all that jazz, find Virtual Hydlide. I guarantee you won't be disappointed. Well, you may be disappointed in the technical shortcomings as outlined in the article there. Seriously, the frame rate of this is like a flick book. It's truly atrocious at times. And the combat, bosses aside, the combat is fairly, you can just run through it. It's fairly optional. There is a point system, an old school point system. Every time you kill an enemy, you get points towards a high score. but there's an in-game store in the game that you can use your points to buy items. So it's not necessarily skippable if you're struggling a bit with the boss battles, if you want to go back and get certain items. The reason I recommend this for people who like Dark Souls and Soulsborne is that it's difficult. It really does scratch that itch that that's ferrying us Soulsborne fans along there. We like that difficulty. Now, half of that difficulty comes from the technical shortcomings, which is a challenge unto itself. But I wouldn't say that's anything to scoff at. I'd say that's a challenge to be taken on. The combat itself, well, it's not necessarily challenging outright. When you've got multiple enemies, that's where it really becomes challenging. And then the boss battles themselves, those are fairly challenging. There is ways to exploit them. If you're going in blind, you won't know what they are. But if you go on YouTube, every Hydlide video out there will show you how to exploit or skip segments of the game. I should also mention there is a speedrunning community for the game as well, which is kind of unusual given the randomly generating nature of the game. So if you want something that's challenging, you've got a Sega Saturn, or if you're thinking about getting a Sega Saturn and starting a wee Saturn collection, Virtual Hydlide is probably the way to go. Not just that, but how cool is that artwork? Now this is the EU artwork, the American artwork's more painted, but this is pure 90s FMV goodage. So personally, I'd rather pick that up for collector's purposes. But if you're in North America, then you get what you get, I guess.